Hello and welcome to another edition of Encounter. Tonight we're going to talk about a subject that has been on people's minds and will be for quite a while. It's the issue of globalization. You've heard about globalization. It has economic, cultural, financial, political dimensions. Tonight's episode is with الحي زلوم. الحي زلوم is a prominent businessman. He has over 40 years of experience in the Middle East. He's U.S. educated and has worked in management, petroleum fields, trade, industry, and he has just written a book called The Globalization Gospel. The Globalization Gospel is a book that was just published earlier this year in 1999, and we will talk about the subjects or the issues that he raises in this very fascinating and important book, in which he tries to give a critique and an analysis of the whole process of globalization. Mr. Zalloum, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
I've been following this whole issue of globalization, as many people have, I think, in the Middle East, with both fascination and hope on one side, and also some concern on the other side. Tell us, first of all, why did you call this book The Globalization Gospel? Why did you use the word gospel?
Well, actually, the name, really, I should give the credit for the name to a friend of mine in New York. And his name is Jonathan Peele. He was the chief editor for Scientific American, and he was a colleague of mine at Harvard Graduate School of Business. When I gave the manuscript to Jonathan and his wife, who's also a literary agent, the title of the book was Info Financial Capitalism.
Wow.
They thought the name was complicated, and they thought that for the publication of the book, if I would use this globalization gospel, it would probably be better, because also I have used the word, the globalization gospel, because now the globalization has been elevated almost to become a religion. So for this reason I accepted their recommendation, and I changed the name, so this is how the name took its name.
You go through a rather extensive analysis that's both historical but also contemporary in terms of what is globalization and what kind of impact is it having on societies around the world. Summarize for us, if you could, briefly, the main thesis of your book. What's the point you're trying to make?
Well, the point simply is this. Globalization is a historical process that we just cannot stop it. The vehicles of globalization, such as computers, telecommunications, and all these new technologies, these are positive instruments that, if properly used, they can draw people together, they can make really peace on earth. However, the systems that are within the vehicle of this vehicle of globalization, these systems that make out of growth a religion, regardless of fairness and regardless of what they call side effects, such as we have witnessed in Southeast Asia and some other places, we are concerned about these side effects that can actually cause misery and considerable tragedies throughout the world.
What kind of side effects are you talking about? Unemployment, gaps in income, natural environment?
Well, maybe I can put it this way. The globalization itself has been, I mean, it didn't just come. As I said, it was a natural process, and in certain ways, people didn't even know that it was coming. And the vehicles of globalization, they themselves came by coincidence. What I mean, for example, in 1957 and 58, several things occurred that people didn't find to be significant. For one thing, at that time, the Russians got Sputnik. People thought that the world is getting to be larger.
Sputnik was the first satellite.
Yes. But then actually what happened was the people got smaller, not larger. Another thing that occurred at that time, for the first time in history, the white-collar workers in the United States, for example, became equal, and then afterwards more than the blue-collar workers. Now, the tools of globalization, people at that time stopped to say, well, what's going on in this world? Some people call it this post-industrial age, until somebody came and coined the global village. He said, well, what is happening is we are now having a global village. The world is smaller, it's not larger, it's not bigger. And as a result, we have seen technological innovations that has revolutionized the technology and the communications that connected people closer and closer together. Also within that 1 year of 57, by the way, it just also happened that two scientists at two separate places in the United States, one at Texas Instruments and another one at Fairchild Semiconductors, they simultaneously discovered the silicon chip, which also revolutionized the world.
Which led to the computer.
Which got into computer and these technologies. So then, what I am saying is, this natural process came without even people recognizing it. The tools that resulted actually were not even intended for globalization. The Russians, they got the Sputnik for military purposes, but then satellites became the tools for telecommunications, and so on.
But you're talking about basically when we talk about globalization, we're talking about the triumph of capitalism on a global scale, using the instruments of telecommunications, satellites, telephones, computers, and financial globalization at the same time. That's a sort of uncontrolled global capitalism. Isn't that what we're talking about?
Correct. Actually, what we are saying is this. We have tools of globalization that are instrumental for the development of the world, and they are historical realities. And these tools, like any other tool, they can be used constructively or destructively. It all depends on what vehicles that you will have inside these vehicles. I mean, if I want to make it as a very simple, to make it very simple using today's language of computers, globalization is like the hardware. I mean, the tools, they are the hardware. There are computers, there are telecommunications, these are the things that interconnect the world together. But the systems inside are the software, the economic systems, the cultural values, and so on. These are systems, these are the software. Now, what I am debating in this book is the software. Now, I cannot, argue that the tools of globalization are great. We should try to know as much as we know about them to maximize their use. But I am debating the software and the systems that are packaged within these vehicles by virtue of lots of things. And one of it probably is the speed of how things have developed. So, but then I am not only the one who is debating these systems. You said about historically speaking, I would like to differentiate between then the systems of globalization and between the vehicles, the instruments, the tools of globalization. Now, globalization systems are not something new. The spread of capitalism via the globalization tools is something that accelerated basically at the start of this decade due to the jumps and leaps of technological innovations plus the collapse of the competitor system in the world, which was the Soviet system.
Yeah.
So as that system collapsed, one system remained, and it was packaged in the globalization vehicle, and it is now becoming the law of the village, the global village.
But you're saying that some of the impact, or much of the impact of globalization, is negative and unacceptable. Give us some examples. What kind of problems are you critical of?
Yeah. Well, you know, first of all, maybe we can talk about how did the global economy and the global vision first got started. It didn't just start yesterday or at the beginning of this decade, as some people thought. The global economy and the global economic vision was a planned vision that started actually just about the start of the Second World War. At that time, the United States was in a Great Depression that started 10 years earlier, in 1929. And in this Great Depression, they have tried many innovative means and ways to get out of it. And the public sector and the private sector and the academia in the United States combined, and they created what they called peace and war studies groups. And these groups, among the first priority for them was that let us see how can we prevent the reoccurrence of Great Depressions once and for all. And mind you that even in 1939, the American economy volume was barely what it was 10 years earlier at the start of the economic turmoil in the Great Depression. And they formed several groups, study groups, and these groups actually, there was an economic and financial group, a political group, an armament group, a peace aims group. These studies involved 100 people from the juice of the crop, I mean from the minds of the American universities, institutions, think tanks, State Department, and other government institutions. And they used to come with recommendations and studies, and once approved, they became, the agenda for implementation.
But what you're saying is basically this process led ultimately to this dominance of global capitalism.
That is correct. For example, the memorandum EA-17 of 14th of June 1941 discussed, quotation, one world economy dominated by the United States. Memorandum EB-34 of 24th of July 1941 defined a grand area concept, which is to include practically all the non-communist countries along with the United States. And that same memorandum recommended the creation of an international financial institution, which became the IMF later on. It recommended an international banking institution, which became the World Bank afterwards. And Isaiah Bowman one of the head of the groups suggested a post-war United Nations, and actually the Charter of the United Nations was charted by him, completed by July 1944.
Now, I think that nobody disputes this, that there was a global struggle between communism and capitalism throughout much of the century. The communists lost, the capitalists won. We are in a one global capitalist world today. Why is this something that we have to be concerned about? Why is capitalism globalized a bad thing that you are, or parts of it are a bad thing? What are the bad effects?
Well, for one thing, you know, things should not be given as black and white. You know, I mean,
you say in the book that there's some good, positive dimensions.
You know, things are not black and white. You know, it's not either that you are with or you are against. What we are saying is the unfairness aspect of capitalism is something nobody really should insist on, but it is really the core of the system.
Unfairness, how?
Well, I will tell you, you know, John Keynes is one of the most renowned economists in this century, and he's actually the father of the Bretton Woods institutions, and he's a very well-known economist. And one of his well-known saying is, "Let us all pretend that fair is foul and foul is fair." As Madeleine Albright, when she was going to Southeast Asia for an EPIC meeting, said, well, what we care for is to recover growth, and as far as for the unfair things that occur to the people there, it's unfortunate, but it's too bad.
Unfair meaning people will be unemployed, some will be poor, some will be...
I will give you examples. You mean, if you want examples, I will give you an example as in Indonesia. In Indonesia, when they first heard of the Thailand crisis, which was caused by global capitalism, speculative economy, and financial economy, they immediately called the IMF, and they have asked them to please come and see what you can do and what can we do. And they gave them a clean bill that your fundamentals are just fine, you've got absolutely nothing to worry about. And weeks later, when the speculators, and this is one part of the ills of global capitalism, is this speculative economy that it created, which now overburdens the productive economy. So what happened? They speculated on the Indonesian currency, and the Jakarta stock market collapsed. The majority, I mean, except for 20 companies, 250 other companies, or 30 companies, 250 companies collapsed.
In Indonesia?
In Indonesia, over a couple of weeks' time. And there was, the fundamentals of the Indonesian economy was just fine. There was absolutely no problem. Let us say that caused something to happen internally within this 1 month, except it was an external event. It was speculators from outside the borders speculating with the Indonesian currency.
Basically they're selling the Indonesian currency or taking their investments out?
Yes, for speculative purposes. Now, the misery, the unfairness, well, very simple. The number of Indonesian people who became below the poverty line doubled in 1 year. It came from 40 to 45. Now it is 100 million Indonesians are below the poverty line. What did they do, these people? I mean, these people have done absolutely nothing. I mean, they were subjected to forces of global financial capitalism from outside their frontiers. Now, when the Indonesian people tried to find remedies to this, the IMF came and they gave them its normal prescription. And they tried it, and it backfired. So the Indonesian government, Suharto, he tried to do something about it. He brought some people from Johns Hopkins University, somebody, Professor Hanks, and they proposed a currency board and this and that, which was other than what the IMF proposed. Summers, who is now the Secretary of Treasury, was in Indonesia. He called Clinton and he said, look, these guys are not doing what the IMF is asking to. So Clinton called and he told Suharto that you have to accept the IMF remedies as if it comes from the hand of God, unquote. Unquote.
Yeah.
So here is some president of a country who tried the prescriptions of the IMF. He suffered. He went for prescriptions from a different source within the American system, and he was not allowed to make the remedies as was prescribed by other than the IMF people. Now, everybody, including the IMF, say that we have done wrong, that we have made a blunder. But what was the cost? An additional 50 million people below poverty line. This is the kind of unfairness that we talk about.
But the problem I see is that given these realities, and many people who support globalization will admit that there are these problems, that some people suffer, some people are unemployed, there are gaps between rich and poor, there are dominant relationships between the northern industrial states and the southern developing countries. People recognize that, nobody denies it, but the advocates of globalization say if we just continue on this process, eventually there'll be more trade, more investment, everybody will get richer in the long run. The problem, it seems to me, is that most of the countries of the world don't seem to have much of an option. I mean, in Indonesia, in Thailand, in Mexico today, in Jordan, in most countries of the third world, people are changing their systems to attract foreign investors. They want people to come here and make clothing factories and sneakers factories and table cookingware factories and whatever it is that people want to export around the world. Are there any realistic options to the present globalization system?
Yeah, actually, yes, there are viable options. And I just finished telling you that there was an option that was provided, for example, to Indonesia.
But it wasn't politically possible.
But it was, well, I mean, why?
Yeah, that's, I mean...
the question, so then we have to say, why was this not possible? And if you scrutinize the reason why this was not possible, then you would say you have to stop the interference of outside forces to not allow people who should know better their economy to do what they think is better for them. And this is basically the basic problem. I mean, I will give you this as an example. I give you another example for in Indonesia, in Malaysia. In Malaysia, when the Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad, who is the father of their economical miracle, as it is called, saw what is happening around him, he said, well, what's the problem? So they started to have, the speculators started to invade Malaysia. So he said, okay, I'm going to make currency controls. I'm not going to allow them to do what they did elsewhere. The IMF objected to that. And now everybody say that Mahathir Mohamad saved Malaysia.
Even though they were experienced some problems with the whole East Asian
because he did a non-IMF prescription. He did what he thought was best for Indonesia, not for the IMF.
For Malaysia.
For Malaysia, not for the IMF. And the end result was now investors themselves are coming back. And the recovery was faster in Malaysia than any other place. I'll give you another alternative. The problem, I mean, the other alternative, for example, is the Japanese version of capitalism. It's a state capitalism which actually puts full employment as part of its social package. It values the predominance of the group over individuals. It puts the culture of Japan within its economic system. Now Japan is not allowing to do that. Is not allowed to do that. Japan, this system of Japan has been under attack ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union. In other words, even capitalism itself had varieties of capitalism. There was, you know, and these varieties, they used to spring from within the country's social, ethical standards. Now, with this globalization, the speculative financial economy, which is now predominant, is preventing, through the force and the might that it has, it is preventing people like Japan, people like Malaysia, if they could, and other places, to do what they think is better for their economy. Because they have a certain agenda, and they want to see that this agenda is to be implemented. Now, this agenda is not necessarily, it's good for the investors, it may be good for the United States economy, and it may not necessarily be good, it may not be necessarily bad also to every other economy in the world. One, if I would talk as a management consultant, I can put it in a different way also. The speed, the management of change is the most difficult type of management that you could ever impose on anybody. And the faster it is, the harder it is. The radical changes and the speed of changes that has been occurring, actually these changes were ahead of the management standards, rules and institutions that are in place to make proper control.
We only have 2 minutes left. I want to ask you one last question. Given all this reality, what are the implications for countries like Jordan? We are, like most Arab countries, we are moving along with this globalization process, opening our markets, liberalizing our financial structure, promoting foreign investments and exports. Are we falling into a trap blindfolded? Are we going to suffer for this? Or are there precautions that perhaps we should take, knowing now the reality of globalization and some of its positive and negative effects?
Well, first of all, we are suffering. Not we are going to suffer, because we are already suffering.
In terms of unemployment, poverty?
In terms of unemployment, increase of poverty, and etc., and the decrease of the standard of living, and we are suffering already. That's number one. Number two, what can we do about it? Yes, there are certain things that you can do about it. For one thing, we should not really go into this process of globalization without proper preparation. For example, you cannot expect each industry in the world, each economy in the world passed through natural stages of development. It went, you know, protectionism, for example, was part of the American economy for a very long period of time. So what protected Korea and Japan and got them to get to a good industrial level and to make their economy what it is was basically that also, that it protected their economy for a certain time. We are at different stages of development in Jordan than Korea, than Japan, than the United States. And what applies well to a developed country, the economy, for example, does not necessarily develop to, or should be applied to an economy, a young economy like the Jordan economy. So the Jordan economy actually was prevented from the benefit of the incubation period that is necessary for any economy. History will tell you that economies need an incubation period. And while we were amidst this incubation period, unfortunately, we had to do lots of structural changes without proper preparatory work. I mean, this is basically the problem.
We've unfortunately run out of time. Abdul-Hayy Zalloum, you've written a very interesting and provocative and useful book, The Globalization Gospel. We will keep tracking the globalization process, as I'm sure you will, and perhaps we can talk again in the future as more analysis is done. Thank you very much for being with us and talking to us about this.
Thank you.
You bet. That's the show for tonight. Thank you for being with us. Join us again next week at the same time. Good night.